The formation stretched across Fort Benning's parade ground like a living map of military precision. 275 soldiers stood at attention under the Georgia sun, their boots gleaming, their uniforms crisp, their eyes fixed forward, in the disciplined silence that defined Army life. But in 30 seconds, that silence would be shattered by a single moment that would change everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the woman they had barely noticed standing in the back row. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Derek Lawson strutted across the formation with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. His silver bars caught the sunlight, his chest thrust forward in the swagger that came with 3 years of commanding respect through fear rather than leadership. He had spotted his target weeks ago. Private First Class Sarah Chun, the quiet logistics specialist who kept her head down and her mouth shut. The perfect victim for a predator who mistook silence for weakness. What Captain Lawson didn't know was that Sarah Chun had been silent for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with discipline. What he couldn't have imagined was that the woman he was about to corner had capabilities that would leave him unconscious on the ground while 275 witnesses watched in stunned amazement, thought the alarm clock screamed at 0445 hours. But Private First Class Sarah Chen was already awake. She had been awake for the past 20 minutes, lying motionless in her narrow bunk while her roommates snored softly in the darkness. Sleep had never come easily to Sarah, not since she was 12 years old and learned that the world could be a dangerous place for women who looked vulnerable. Sarah swung her legs out of bed with practiced silence, her bare feet touching the cold linoleum floor of the barracks. At 24, she had the kind of understated presence that made her nearly invisible in large groups. Average height, average build, with straight black hair that she kept regulation short and dark eyes that revealed nothing of the thoughts behind them. Her face was pleasant, but unmemorable, the kind that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. She moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower in 3 minutes flat, teeth brushed, hair combed and pinned back in the regulation style that had been drilled into every female soldier since basic training. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every button aligned with mathematical precision. Sarah had learned early in her military career that excellence in the small details created a protective camouflage that kept unwanted attention at bay. The barracks came alive around her as other soldiers began their own morning routines. Conversations buzzed in low voices, the sound of running water echoed from the communal showers, and the familiar sounds of military life filled the air. Sarah participated in none of it. She nodded politely when spoken to, answered direct questions with the minimum necessary words, and maintained the careful distance that had become her signature trait. "Morning, Chen," called out Specialist Jennifer Martinez, one of the few soldiers who had attempted to break through Sarah's reserve. "Are you heading to Chow?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice pleasant but neutral. She had perfected the art of being cordial without being inviting, friendly without encouraging deeper connection. It wasn't that she disliked her fellow soldiers, but experience had taught her that anonymity was safer than friendship, invisibility more valuable than popularity. The mess hall buzzed with the energy of 275 soldiers, beginning another day of training and duties. Sarah moved through the food line with efficient speed, selecting scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee. She found an empty seat at the end of a long table, positioning herself where she could observe the room while remaining inconspicuous. This had become her standard practice, a habit so ingrained that she no longer consciously thought about it. From her vantage point, Sarah could see the entire social ecosystem of the company. The popular soldiers clustered around tables in the center of the room, their voices carrying over the general noise as they told stories and shared jokes. The athletes gravitated toward each other, their conversation focused on upcoming competitions and physical training challenges. The intellectuals formed their own group, discussing everything from military strategy to current events with the intensity of graduate students. And then there were the predators. Sarah's eyes tracked Captain Derek Lawson as he moved through the mess hall like a shark cruising through a school of fish. He stopped at different tables, his smile wide and his voice carrying the forced joviality of an officer trying too hard to be liked by his subordinates. But Sarah saw what others missed: the way his hand lingered on the shoulders of female soldiers when he leaned in to speak, the way his eyes tracked certain women as they moved through the room, the subtle territorial markers that said he considered the soldiers under his command as more than just professional subordinates. Lawson was 32, married with 2 children whose pictures decorated his office like trophies. He had been promoted to captain 2 years ahead of schedule, a fact he mentioned frequently and attributed to his natural leadership abilities. His personnel file was immaculate, filled with commendations and positive evaluations from superior officers who saw only what he wanted them to see. But Sarah had learned to read people the way others read books, and she could see the darkness that lurked behind Lawson's perfect military facade. The captain's attention had been shifting towards Sarah over the past several weeks, though she doubted anyone else had noticed. It started with casual glances during formation, his eyes lingering on her just a fraction longer than military professionalism demanded. Then came the unnecessary interactions during duty hours, finding excuses to speak with her about logistics matters that could have been handled through the chain of command. The conversations were always professional on the surface, but Sarah felt the undercurrent of something else, something that made her skin crawl and her instincts scream warnings. Sarah finished her breakfast in silence and cleared her tray with the same methodical efficiency that characterized everything she did. The day ahead would be filled with the routine duties that defined her role as a logistics specialist: inventory management, supply coordination, equipment maintenance logs. Work that was essential to military operations, but invisible to most soldiers who took for granted that ammunition would be available when needed, that equipment would function properly, that the complex web of supplies and materials would continue flowing seamlessly. The logistics bay was Sarah's domain, a warehouse, space filled with carefully organized supplies and equipment. She had transformed what had previously been a chaotic storage area into a model of efficiency that had earned grudging respect from senior NCOs who had initially doubted her capabilities. Every item had its designated location, every piece of equipment was properly maintained and documented. Every supply request was processed with speed and accuracy that exceeded Army standards. Sarah took pride in her work, though she expressed that pride quietly and without fanfare. She had discovered that competence combined with invisibility created the perfect professional combination. Superior officers knew they could depend on her to handle logistics matters without supervision or drama. Fellow enlisted soldiers appreciated that she could locate needed supplies quickly and without bureaucratic delays. Everyone benefited from her efficiency, but few thought of her as more than a reliable cog in the military machine. The morning passed in its usual routine of checking inventory levels, processing supply requests, and updating maintenance logs. Sarah worked alone, preferring the solitude to the complications that came with close working relationships. She had learned to be self-sufficient in all things, relying on her own judgment and capabilities rather than depending on others who might prove unreliable or untrustworthy. At 1100 hours, Captain Lawson appeared in the logistics bay doorway. His sudden presence was not unusual. Officers frequently inspected work areas and checked on the progress of various duties. But something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. He was alone, which was slightly unusual for an officer conducting official business. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes held an intensity that had nothing to do with military duties. "Private Chun," he said, his voice carrying the authority of rank, but with an undertone that made Sarah's muscles tense involuntarily. "I need to discuss some supply issues with you." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the neutral tone that had become her shield against unwanted attention. She set down her clipboard and turned to face him, positioning herself so that she had clear sight lines to both the exit and the emergency communication system. Lawson stepped into the warehouse space, closing the distance between them with the casual confidence of a predator who believed he had cornered his prey. He began speaking about ammunition supplies and equipment maintenance schedules, but Sarah could see that his attention was focused on her rather than the professional matters he was supposedly discussing. His eyes moved over her uniform in a way that had nothing to do with military standards and everything to do with the objectification that she had learned to recognize and fear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You've been doing excellent work, Private," Lawson continued, his voice dropping to a lower register that triggered every self-defense instinct Sarah had developed over the years. "I think it's time we discussed your potential for advancement. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with recognizing danger. Her heart rate increased, her breathing became more controlled, and her muscles prepared for action while her face remained perfectly calm and professional. Years of training had taught her to mask her emotional responses while her mind rapidly assessed threats and calculated potential responses. "Sir, I believe all discussions regarding advancement should be conducted through proper channels and documented according to military regulations," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. Lawson's smile took on a predatory quality that confirmed Sarah's worst fears about his intentions. He took another step closer, violating the professional distance that should exist between officers and enlisted personnel. His hand moved toward her shoulder in a gesture that was clearly intended to be the first step in an escalating pattern of inappropriate contact. What Captain Derek Lawson couldn't have known was that Private First Class Sarah Chun had been preparing for exactly this moment since she was 14 years old. What he couldn't have imagined was that the quiet logistics specialist who kept her head down and avoided attention possessed capabilities that would have impressed special forces, instructors, and terrified hand-to-hand combat experts. Sarah had learned to hide her true abilities the same way she hid everything else about herself, keeping her most dangerous skills buried beneath layers of carefully cultivated invisibility. But as Lawson's hand reached toward her shoulder and his intentions became unmistakable, Sarah began making calculations that had nothing to do with supply inventories and everything to do with the physics of human vulnerability. The warehouse was empty except for the two of them. The nearest soldiers were in the motor pool 50 yards away. The logistics bay had thick concrete walls that would muffle sounds. Captain Lawson had chosen his hunting ground carefully, believing he had created the perfect environment for the assault he was planning. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Sarah Chun was the victim he believed her to be, a quiet young woman who could be intimidated and overpowered by his superior rank and physical presence. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her invisibility for vulnerability, her careful distance for fear. Sarah allowed Lawson to believe he held the advantage while her mind ran through the scenarios that might unfold in the next few minutes. She calculated angles of attack, identified potential weapons among the warehouse equipment, and prepared herself mentally for actions that would change both their lives forever. The moment of truth was approaching, though Captain Lawson remained blissfully unaware that he was about to become the victim rather than the predator. In his arrogance, he couldn't imagine that the woman he was about to assault possessed the skills necessary to defend herself. In his hubris, He couldn't conceive that his attempted attack would become the catalyst for a demonstration of combat prowess that would leave 275 soldiers questioning everything they thought they knew about power and capability. Sarah Chin stood perfectly still, her face expressionless, her body language giving no hint of the storm that was building inside her disciplined mind. She had spent years preparing for this exact scenario, training for the day when someone would mistake her careful invisibility for helpless vulnerability. That day had finally arrived, and Sarah was ready to show Captain Derek Lawson and anyone else who cared to watch exactly what happened when a predator chose the wrong prey. Captain Derek Lawson had built his reputation on a foundation of calculated charm and strategic intimidation. His office walls displayed the trophies of a career engineered for advancement, commendation letters from commanding officers, photographs with high-ranking military officials, and certificates from leadership. Courses that had taught him how to project authority while concealing his true nature. The silver captain's bars on his uniform represented more than rank. They were weapons he wielded with precision against anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. The morning formation at Fort Benning stretched across the parade ground. Like a chessboard of human pieces, each soldier positioned according to rank, height, and unit designation. 275 men and women stood in perfect alignment, their uniforms crisp in the Georgia humidity, their faces locked in the neutral expressions that military discipline demanded. From his position at the front of the formation, Lawson surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a feudal lord reviewing his subjects. "Listen up, soldiers." Lawson's voice carried across the formation with the practiced authority of 3 years in command. "Today's training schedule will test your commitment to excellence. I expect nothing less than perfection from each and every one of you. Those who meet the standard will be recognized. Those who fail will face consequences." His eyes swept across the ranks, lingering on specific individuals who had earned his attention for various reasons. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, whose leadership abilities threatened to overshadow Lawson's own reputation. Specialist David Kim, whose technical expertise had begun attracting notice from higher command. And in the back row, barely visible among the other soldiers, Private First Class Sarah Chun, whose quiet competence had become an irritation that demanded correction. The company structure at Fort Benning operated according to an unwritten hierarchy that extended far beyond the official chain of command. Lawson had spent months carefully cultivating relationships and establishing dominance patterns that ensured his authority remained unquestioned. He understood that true power came not from the rank insignia on his uniform, but from his ability to control the social dynamics that govern daily military life. First Sergeant Patricia Womack stood at rigid attention beside him, her 22 years of service evident in every precise movement. Womack represented the old guard of military leadership, soldiers who had earned their positions through competence and dedication rather than political maneuvering. Her presence beside Lawson created a facade of legitimacy that concealed the captain's more questionable leadership methods. "First Sergeant Womack will brief you on today's training requirements," Lawson continued, stepping aside with a gesture that appeared generous but was calculated to demonstrate his control over even the most senior enlisted personnel. "Remember that your performance reflects not only on yourselves, but on the entire company." Dismissed. The formation dissolved into organized movement as soldiers dispersed to their assigned duties. Lawson remained in position, observing the patterns of interaction that revealed the social structure of his command. He had learned to read these dynamics like a predator studying a herd, identifying the strong animals that might pose challenges and the vulnerable ones that could be isolated and controlled. Specialist Jennifer Martinez approached her group of friends with the easy confidence of someone secure in her position within the company hierarchy. Martinez had earned respect through her technical skills and natural leadership abilities, making her a valuable ally for soldiers seeking advancement and a potential threat to officers who preferred compliant subordinates. Did you catch that tone in the captain's voice? Martinez asked quietly as she fell into step with several other specialists. Something's got him wound tighter than usual. Private First Class Tommy Wilson, a 19-year-old from rural Alabama who still carried himself with the uncertainty of someone new to military life, glanced nervously toward where Lawson stood observing the dispersing formation. "Captain, seems all right to me. Always professional when I've dealt with him." Martinez exchanged a knowing look with Specialist Lisa Rodriguez, a combat medic, whose experience with trauma had taught her to recognize predatory behavior in all its forms. "Tommy, you're 6'2" and built like a linebacker." The captain's version of professional might look different depending on who he's dealing with. The conversation reflected a tension that ran through the entire company structure. Soldiers like Martinez and Rodriguez, who possessed the experience and confidence to recognize inappropriate behavior, found themselves constantly navigating between their duty to maintain good order and discipline and their responsibility to protect more vulnerable members of their unit. It was a delicate balance that required careful judgment and considerable courage. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres had noticed similar patterns during his 8 years of service. As one of the senior enlisted leaders in the company, Torres occupied a position that required him to bridge the gap between the officer corps and the enlisted personnel. His broad shoulders and graying temples gave him a gravitas that younger soldiers respected, but his integrity put him at odds with officers who preferred loyalty over honesty. Torres had been watching Captain Lawson carefully for months, documenting patterns of behavior that troubled him but fell just short of actionable misconduct. There were the extended private meetings with female soldiers that served no clear military purpose. The tendency to assign certain women to duties that isolated them from their peers. The way Lawson's voice and demeanor changed when he interacted with soldiers he perceived as vulnerable or isolated. "Sergeant Torres," Lawson called out as the formation area cleared. "I need to discuss some personnel matters with you." Torres approached with the measured pace of a senior NCO who had learned to project calm professionalism regardless of his personal feelings. "Yes, sir. What can I help you with?" "I've been reviewing the performance records of some of our newer soldiers," Lawson began, his tone carrying the false concern of a commander who claimed to care about his subordinates' welfare. "Private Chun in logistics has been showing some concerning patterns. Antisocial behavior, resistance to authority, potential disciplinary issues." The accusation caught Torres off guard. Sarah Chun was among the most reliable soldiers in the company, her work consistently exceeding standards while she maintained the kind of low profile that superior NCOs appreciated. Her logistical expertise had resolved numerous supply issues that could have compromised training schedules or operational readiness. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand," Torres replied carefully. "Private Chun's performance evaluations have been consistently superior. Her work in logistics has been exemplary, and I haven't received any reports of disciplinary problems." Lawson's expression shifted subtly, revealing a flash of irritation before resuming its mask of professional concern. "Sergeant, sometimes the most dangerous problems are the ones that aren't immediately visible. Soldiers who isolate themselves from their peers, who resist normal social interaction, who maintain excessive emotional distance. These can be warning signs of deeper issues." The conversation represented a masterclass in manipulative leadership. Lawson was attempting to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah Chun's reliability while positioning himself as the perceptive commander who could identify problems that escaped the notice of his subordinates. It was a technique he had used successfully in previous assignments, turning a soldier's strengths into perceived weaknesses that justified increased scrutiny and intervention. Torres found himself in the impossible position that defined much of his daily experience as a senior enlisted leader. His professional obligation required him to take seriously any concerns raised by his commanding officer, but his instincts and experience suggested that Lawson's concerns about Sarah Chun were manufactured rather than genuine. "What specific actions would you like me to take regarding Private Chun?" Torres asked, choosing his words with the precision of someone navigating a potential minefield. "Increased supervision," Lawson replied smoothly. "More frequent interaction with her peers. Perhaps some additional duties that would require closer coordination with other soldiers. We need to break down these antisocial barriers before they become serious problems." The directive was phrased in terms of soldier welfare and unit cohesion, but Torres recognized it as something far more sinister. Lawson was systematically dismantling the protective barriers that Sarah Chun had constructed around herself, creating opportunities for the kind of isolated interaction that predators required to operate effectively. Meanwhile, in the company's administrative office, Staff Sergeant Monica Blake was discovering her own reasons for concern about Captain Lawson's leadership style. Blake served as the company's senior administrative specialist, a position that gave her access to personnel records, duty rosters, and scheduling information that revealed patterns invisible to most soldiers. Blake had noticed that certain female soldiers were being assigned to duties that isolated them from their peers with increasing frequency. Late-night inventory duties performed alone. Equipment inspections conducted in remote locations. Training sessions scheduled during periods when normal supervision was minimal. Each assignment appeared legitimate when viewed individually, but collectively they formed a pattern that triggered her professional instincts. The administrative records also revealed other concerning trends. Female soldiers who raised complaints about inappropriate behavior found themselves transferred to different duties or receiving negative performance evaluations that seemed inconsistent with their actual work quality. Medical records showed an uptick in stress-related symptoms among women in the company, along with increased requests for transfers that suggested systemic problems rather than individual issues. Blake found herself in the difficult position of possessing information that suggested serious problems, while lacking the authority or evidence necessary to address them through official channels. Her role as an administrative specialist required her to maintain confidentiality regarding personnel matters, but her conscience demanded that she find ways to protect soldiers who might be at risk. The company mess hall during lunch served as an informal intelligence network where information flowed through carefully constructed social channels. Soldiers who might never speak openly about their concerns could communicate through subtle signals, shared glances, and coded conversations that revealed the true state of morale and unit cohesion. Specialist Martinez found herself at the center of these informal networks, her natural leadership abilities making her a focal point for soldiers seeking guidance or support. Her table became a gathering point for women who needed to share experiences and concerns without risking official retaliation. "Has anyone else noticed the captain's been scheduling more individual meetings lately?" Rodriguez asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the general noise of the mess hall conversation. Private Second-Class Angela Foster, a supply clerk who worked closely with Sarah Chun in logistics operations, leaned forward with the careful attention of someone sharing sensitive information. "He's been showing up in the supply areas a lot more. Always finds reasons to talk to Chun when she's working alone." The conversation represented the kind of informal intelligence gathering that occurred in military units, where official channels failed to address legitimate concerns. These women had learned to share information and provide mutual protection through networks that operated parallel to but separate from the official command structure. Foster continued with growing confidence, as she realized her observations were shared by others. "There's something about the way he looks at her. And the questions he asks don't really have anything to do with logistics or supply management. It's like he's probing for personal information." Martinez nodded grimly, her expression reflecting the frustration of someone who recognized a dangerous situation, but lacked the power to address it directly. The problem is that everything he's doing falls just inside the boundaries of what could be considered normal officer behavior. Unless he actually crosses a line, there's no official action we can take. Rodriguez, whose medical training had given her experience with assault cases and their aftermath, understood the tactical challenges that victims faced when dealing with predators who operated within institutional structures. The worst part is that if Sarah tries to report inappropriate behavior before something obvious happens, she'll be the one who gets in trouble for making false accusations against a superior officer. The conversation highlighted the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed predatory behavior to flourish within military organizations. The same hierarchical structures that enabled effective command and control also created opportunities for abuse by those who understood how to manipulate authority for personal gratification. Captain Lawson's success in maintaining his position while engaging in increasingly aggressive behavior represented a masterclass in institutional manipulation. He had learned to operate within the gray areas between appropriate and inappropriate conduct, pushing boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability. His rank provided protection from subordinates who might question his actions, while his carefully cultivated reputation with superior officers insulated him from consequences. The afternoon training schedule provided Lawson with additional opportunities to implement his systematic isolation of Sarah Chun. Combat readiness exercises required soldiers to work in small teams, performing tasks that simulated battlefield conditions while being evaluated on their technical competence and ability to function under stress. Lawson positioned himself as a roving evaluator, moving between different training stations while ostensibly monitoring performance and providing guidance. This role gave him legitimate reasons to interact with individual soldiers while maintaining the authority to direct their activities according to his assessment of training requirements. When he approached Sarah's training station, where she was conducting equipment maintenance procedures with methodical precision, Lawson carried himself with the confident authority of an officer conducting routine evaluation. To casual observers, his interaction with the private appeared entirely professional and appropriate. "Private Chun," Lawson said, his voice carrying across the training area with enough volume to be heard by nearby soldiers. "Your technical proficiency is impressive. I'd like you to demonstrate these procedures for some of the newer personnel who could benefit from your expertise." The request appeared reasonable and even complimentary, recognizing Sarah's competence while providing educational opportunities for less experienced soldiers. But Sarah recognized the tactical elements of the situation that were invisible to others. The demonstration would require her to work closely with Lawson in an instructional capacity, creating opportunities for physical proximity that could be disguised as legitimate training activities. Sarah's response was textbook military professionalism, acknowledging the order while maintaining the emotional distance that had become her trademark. "Yes, sir. When would you like me to conduct these demonstrations?" "This evening after regular training hours," Lawson replied, his tone suggesting routine scheduling rather than deliberate isolation. "We can use the maintenance bay where you'll have access to all the necessary equipment. I'll personally oversee the instruction to ensure it meets training standards." The scheduling represented another tactical element in Lawson's systematic approach to creating vulnerability. Evening hours meant fewer soldiers would be present in the training areas. The maintenance bay provided an isolated location with limited visibility from other parts of the base. Personal oversight eliminated the presence of other authority figures who might witness inappropriate behavior. As the day's training concluded and soldiers began returning to their barracks for evening personal time, Sarah found herself facing the kind of situation she had been dreading since recognizing Lawson's predatory intentions. The scheduled demonstration created an official requirement for her to be alone with him in an isolated location during hours when normal Supervision would be minimal. The trap had been set with the precision of a military operation, using official channels and legitimate training requirements to create an opportunity for assault that would be difficult to prevent or report. Lawson had maneuvered Sarah into a position where refusing to comply with orders would constitute insubordination, while complying would place her in extreme danger. But what Captain Derek Lawson had failed to recognize was that Private First Class Sarah Chun had been preparing for exactly this scenario since she was a teenager. The quiet logistics specialist who appeared vulnerable and isolated possessed capabilities that would transform his carefully planned assault into a demonstration of combat prowess that would leave him unconscious on the ground while questioning everything he thought he knew about power and predation. The gymnasium at Fort Benning emptied slowly as evening approached, soldiers finishing their personal fitness routines and returning to barracks for the night. In the far corner of the facility, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, a solitary figure moved through combat sequences with fluid precision that would have impressed martial arts instructors at the most elite training facilities in the world. Sarah Chun's movements flowed like water across stone, each strike and defensive position executed with perfect form, while her breathing remained controlled and steady. The heavy bag absorbed impacts that would have staggered most opponents, yet Sarah's face remained expressionless, focused entirely on the mental discipline that transformed physical technique into lethal capability. This was her sanctuary, the one place where she could practice the skills that defined her true identity while maintaining the facade of invisibility that protected her from unwanted attention. For 45 minutes each evening, usually after the gym had cleared of other soldiers, Sarah allowed herself to be who she really was beneath the careful disguise of military conformity. The techniques she practiced belonged to no single martial art but represented a synthesis of combat systems learned over 15 years of dedicated study. Muay Thai strikes flowed into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grappling transitions. Boxing combinations gave way to Krav Maga defensive sequences designed for life-or-death encounters. Each movement had been refined through thousands of repetitions until they became instinctive responses rather than conscious techniques. Sarah's journey toward combat mastery had begun during her sophomore year of high school, triggered by an incident that shattered her naive faith in the basic safety that most people took for granted. Walking home from a late study session at the public library, she had been cornered by 3 men whose intentions became unmistakably clear through their words and actions. Only the intervention of an off-duty police officer had prevented what would have been a life-altering assault. But the experience left Sarah with the terrifying knowledge that predators existed in the world, and that institutional protections meant nothing when faced with determined criminals operating in dark parking lots or empty hallways. Her parents had responded to the incident by enrolling her in a women's self-defense class at the local community center, assuming that a few basic techniques would restore their daughter's confidence and sense of security. But Sarah understood intuitively that basic self-defense was an adequate preparation for the realities of predatory behavior. She needed capabilities that would allow her to neutralize threats decisively rather than simply escape from them. Transition from self-defense student to serious martial artist occurred gradually over several years, driven by Sarah's recognition that true security came only through superior capability, rather than hope that dangerous situations could be avoided. She trained with instructors who had learned their skills in military special operations, law enforcement tactical units, and professional fighting circuits where mistakes resulted in serious injury rather than point deductions. By her senior year of high school, Sarah could disable adult male attackers with techniques that targeted vulnerable anatomical structures with surgical precision. By her second year of college, she was sparring with mixed martial arts fighters who outweighed her by 50 pounds while holding her own through superior technique and tactical intelligence. The decision to enlist in the Army had been motivated partly by financial considerations and partly by her desire to serve her country. but also by recognition that military service would provide access to advanced combat training while surrounding her with the kind of disciplined environment where her skills could be refined without attracting civilian attention that might prove problematic. Basic training had been almost comically easy for someone with Sarah's level of physical conditioning and tactical knowledge. While other recruits struggled with the demands of military fitness standards and basic combat techniques, Sarah found herself constantly holding back to avoid drawing attention from drill sergeants, who might begin asking uncomfortable questions about her background. Advanced individual training for logistics specialists had provided the perfect cover for someone seeking military credentials while avoiding combat roles that might reveal the extent of her capabilities. Supply chain management was essential to military operations, but rarely placed logistics personnel in situations where their combat skills might be tested or discovered. The assignment to Fort Benning represented an ideal posting for maintaining her carefully constructed identity. The base's focus on infantry training and leadership development meant that attention was directed toward soldiers preparing for combat roles rather than support personnel who kept the complex machinery of military operations functioning smoothly. Sarah finished her evening training session with a series of meditation exercises designed to maintain the mental discipline that made physical technique effective in real-world encounters. Combat effectiveness required more than technical proficiency. It demanded the psychological preparation necessary to inflict serious harm on other human beings without hesitation or mercy. The walk back to the barracks provided time for reflection on the increasingly dangerous situation developing with Captain Lawson. Sarah's tactical analysis of his behavior patterns suggested that he was methodically creating conditions for an assault that would be difficult to prevent through official channels and nearly impossible to prove after the fact. Lawson's scheduling of evening training sessions represented a significant escalation in his predatory timeline. The isolation of the maintenance bay, combined with the legitimate authority provided by his officer status, would create optimal conditions for an attack while providing plausible explanations for any evidence that might be discovered later. Sarah understood that she faced an impossible choice between accepting victimization and revealing capabilities that would fundamentally alter her military career and personal security. Fighting back successfully against a superior officer would require explanation of skills that officially didn't exist, training that couldn't be documented, and reflexes that suggested professional combat experience rather than basic military preparation. Back in her barracks room, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk while her roommate worked on correspondence courses at the small desk they shared. The familiar sounds of evening routine echoed through the building as soldiers prepared for another day of training and duties that would begin before dawn. Private First Class Rebecca Walsh was a signal operator from Oregon whose cheerful personality and small-town values made her an ideal roommate for someone seeking to avoid complicated interpersonal dynamics. Walsh treated Sarah with the kind of casual friendliness that required no reciprocal emotional investment while respecting the boundaries that Sarah maintained around her personal life. "You're quieter than usual tonight," Walsh observed without looking up from her textbook. "Is everything okay with work?" The question reflected Walsh's assumption that any concerns in Sarah's life would likely stem from professional duties rather than personal relationships, given her roommate's carefully maintained social isolation. It was a reasonable assumption that highlighted how effectively Sarah had concealed the true nature of her current situation. "Just thinking about upcoming training requirements," Sarah replied, the response technically accurate while revealing nothing of the danger she faced or her preparations for dealing with it. Walsh nodded and returned to her studies, accepting the explanation without curiosity or concern. Their relationship existed within carefully defined boundaries that both women found comfortable, providing companionship without the complications that came with deeper emotional connections. Sarah stared at the ceiling while her mind continued analyzing tactical scenarios and potential responses to the various ways that Captain Lawson's assault might unfold. Her training had included extensive study of predatory behavior patterns, criminal psychology, and the environmental factors that influenced violent encounters. Lawson's approach suggested someone with experience in victimization, a predator who understood how to use institutional authority and environmental control to create optimal conditions for assault, while minimizing his risk of exposure or punishment. His selection of targets indicated psychological sophistication in identifying women who appeared vulnerable while lacking the social connections necessary for effective resistance. The captain's confidence in his ability to assault Sarah without consequences suggested either dangerous overconfidence or knowledge of successful similar attacks that had been concealed or covered up through official channels. Either possibility represented a serious threat that demanded decisive response rather than hope that the situation might resolve itself through official intervention. Sarah's analysis of the physical environment, where the assault would likely occur, revealed several factors that could work in her favor if she chose to resist rather than submit. The maintenance bay contained numerous potential weapons in the form of tools and equipment that could be used to disable an attacker. The concrete floors and walls would amplify the sound of any significant struggle, potentially attracting attention from soldiers in nearby areas. More importantly, the isolated location that Lawson had chosen for its privacy could also provide the concealment necessary for Sarah to employ combat techniques that would leave no witnesses to her true capabilities. If she could disable him quickly and decisively, the incident could be reported as an attempted assault that she had fortunately been able to repel through determination and lucky circumstances. The psychological preparation for potentially lethal violence required careful mental conditioning that Sarah had been developing over years of training with instructors who understood the realities of life or death encounters. Combat effectiveness demanded the ability to inflict maximum damage without hesitation, mercy, or concern for the long-term consequences to either the attacker or defender. Sarah had learned to compartmentalize the emotional and ethical implications of serious violence, treating combat as a technical problem requiring optimal solutions rather than a moral dilemma, demanding careful consideration of competing values. When faced with predatory behavior, the appropriate response was whatever level of force necessary to ensure personal survival and safety. The training session scheduled for the following evening would provide Captain Lawson with what he believed was the perfect opportunity to assault a victim who appeared incapable of effective resistance. His psychological profile suggested a predator who derived satisfaction from the power differential between his authority position and his victim's apparent helplessness. What Lawson couldn't know was that his intended victim had been preparing for exactly this encounter since she was 14 years old. The quiet logistics specialist who avoided social interaction and submitted to authority without question possessed combat capabilities that would transform his planned assault into a demonstration of what happened when predators chose the wrong target. Sarah's hands lay motionless at her sides as she continued her tactical analysis, but her fingers unconsciously traced patterns that corresponded to pressure points and nerve clusters that could disable attackers through precise application of force to vulnerable anatomical structures. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, the same respiratory rhythm she employed during combat training when preparing for techniques that required perfect timing and maximum effectiveness. The intersection of her hidden identity and current crisis represented a test of everything she had learned about surviving in a world where institutional protections were inadequate against determined predators. Tomorrow evening would determine whether years of training and preparation had been sufficient to protect her against someone who believed that rank and authority provided immunity from consequences. In 12 hours, Captain Derek Lawson would discover that his assessment of Private First Class Sarah Chun as a helpless victim represented the most dangerous miscalculation of his military career. The maintenance bay that he had chosen as the site for his assault would become the location where his predatory behavior finally encountered a level of resistance that would leave him unconscious on the concrete floor, while 275 witnesses struggled to understand how their quiet logistics specialist had transformed into someone capable of defeating a superior officer in single combat. Sarah closed her eyes and began the mental rehearsal techniques that would prepare her psychologically for the violence that awaited her. The ghost who had hidden in plain sight for months was finally ready to reveal herself, and Captain Lawson was about to learn that some prey fought back with capabilities that turned hunters into victims and predators into cautionary tales about the dangers of underestimating women who appeared vulnerable but possessed the skills necessary to defend themselves against any threat. The maintenance bay stood empty at 1900 hours, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across workbenches lined with precision tools and diagnostic equipment. The concrete floor bore the oil stains and scuff marks of countless maintenance operations, while the air carried the metallic scent of lubricants and the ozone smell of electrical systems that never fully powered down. Captain Derek Lawson arrived 15 minutes early, his timing calculated to establish territorial control over the environment where his assault would unfold. He moved through the space with the methodical attention of a predator preparing his hunting ground, checking sight lines to ensure privacy, testing the security of doors and windows, positioning equipment to create barriers that would prevent his intended victim from escaping before he accomplished his objectives. The captain's uniform remained perfectly pressed despite the day's activities, his silver bars polished to mirror brightness that reflected the overhead lighting. Every aspect of his appearance projected military professionalism and command authority, creating a facade that concealed the criminal intent driving his carefully orchestrated plan. Lawson's psychological preparation for the assault had been building for weeks, fed by his growing obsession with Sarah Chun and his confidence that military hierarchy provided sufficient protection against consequences. His previous successful attacks on subordinates had established a pattern of behavior that reinforced his belief in his own invulnerability and the helplessness of his victims. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the maintenance concrete corridors, measured and steady in the rhythm that characterized Sarah's movement throughout the base. Lawson positioned himself near the primary workbench, arranging technical manuals and equipment specifications to create the illusion that legitimate training activities were about to commence. Sarah entered the maintenance bay at precisely 19:15 hours, her timing reflecting the punctuality that defined her professional reputation while providing no indication of the tactical calculations that had governed her preparation for this encounter. Her uniform displayed the same attention to detail that characterized everything she did, but trained observers might have noticed subtle differences in her posture and movement that suggested heightened awareness rather than casual compliance. "Private Chun," Lawson began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had proven effective in controlling previous victims. "Thank you for making yourself available for this additional training. Your technical expertise will be valuable for our newer personnel." Sarah acknowledged the statement with a regulation nod, while her eyes conducted rapid assessment of the tactical environment. Exit routes, potential weapons, concealment opportunities, and vulnerability zones were cataloged through peripheral vision while she maintained the appearance of respectful attention to her commanding officer's instructions. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the neutral professionalism that had become her signature trait. "What specific procedures would you like me to demonstrate?" Lawson smiled with the confident expression of someone who believed he controlled every variable in the developing situation. He gestured toward a complex piece of diagnostic equipment positioned in the far corner of the maintenance bay, an area that provided maximum privacy while creating natural barriers against interruption or observation from outside personnel. "Let's start with the advanced troubleshooting procedures for the electrical systems," Lawson said, moving toward the isolated workstation with casual authority that masked his predatory intent. These techniques require close supervision to ensure proper implementation. The captain's selection of training focus provided plausible justification for physical proximity, while creating opportunities for inappropriate contact that could escalate systematically toward outright assault. His approach reflected sophisticated understanding of how predators operated within institutional structures, using legitimate authority to create vulnerable situations that victims found difficult to resist or report. Sarah followed Lawson toward the designated workstation, while her tactical awareness expanded to encompass every detail of their changing position relative to exits, obstacles, and potential interventions. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, but her muscle groups began the subtle preparation that preceded explosive action in life-threatening encounters. The diagnostic equipment required Sarah to lean over the workbench to access internal components, a position that exposed her to approach from behind while limiting her ability to observe Lawson's movements. The captain positioned himself in the tactical location that maximized his advantages while minimizing her defensive options, his movements reflecting experience with similar scenarios rather than spontaneous opportunism. The internal wiring configuration requires careful attention. Lawson continued, stepping closer than professional interaction demanded while his voice dropped to the lower register that had preceded his previous assaults. Let me show you the proper technique for accessing these components. Lawson's hand moved toward Sarah's shoulder with deliberate intent that left no doubt about his true objectives. The gesture appeared supportive and instructional to potential observers, but the pressure and positioning revealed predatory purpose that confirmed Sarah's tactical assessment of the developing threat. The moment of first inappropriate contact triggered physiological responses that Sarah had trained to control through thousands of hours of combat preparation. Adrenaline flooded her system while her heart rate increased and her sensory awareness sharpened to the hyperacute state that preceded life-or-death encounters. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that Lawson was too focused on his intended assault to recognize or heed. "I believe I can handle the technical procedures without additional guidance." Lawson's response revealed the confidence of a predator who believed his victim lacked effective means of resistance. His hand tightened on Sarah's shoulder while his other arm moved to block her potential retreat from the workstation, creating the physical control that would enable escalation to more serious forms of assault. "Private Chun," Lawson said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that he expected would paralyze resistance through military conditioning and fear of insubordination charges. "I think you misunderstand the nature of this training session. There are certain additional skills that soldiers in your position need to develop." The captain's statement removed any remaining ambiguity about his intentions while revealing the psychological tactics he employed to confuse and control his victims. By framing assault as training requirements and resistance as military disobedience, he created mental frameworks that had proven effective in preventing victims from defending themselves effectively. Sarah felt Lawson's grip tighten as his other hand moved toward her waist with unmistakable intent. The confined space behind the workstation eliminated most retreat options, while the captain's superior size and official authority created the power imbalance that had enabled his previous successful attacks on subordinate personnel. But Captain Derek Lawson had made the fatal error of assuming that official authority translated into physical dominance over someone who appeared vulnerable and compliant. His psychological profile of Sarah Chun as a passive victim reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the capabilities that lay beneath her carefully maintained facade of military conformity. Sarah's tactical analysis of the assault's progression indicated that Lawson intended to escalate systematically from inappropriate touching to more serious forms of sexual assault, using his command authority to prevent resistance while his physical advantages prevented escape. The isolated location and evening timing suggested planning that assumed the assault could be completed without interruption or discovery. The captain's hand moved lower on Sarah's body with increasing boldness as his confidence grew in his ability to control the situation through intimidation and physical restraint. His breathing became more rapid and his movements more aggressive as anticipation of successful assault overcame the calculated patience that had characterized his initial approach. This is what happens to soldiers who think they can stay invisible. Lawson whispered with sadistic satisfaction that revealed the psychological gratification he derived from dominating victims who had no apparent means of resistance. Sometimes visibility comes whether you want it or not. The statement represented the culmination of weeks of systematic predation, the moment when Lawson's carefully constructed plan reached its intended conclusion. His hands began working at Sarah's uniform with practiced efficiency that suggested extensive experience with similar assaults, while his positioning prevented her from accessing the exit routes that might have provided escape for less prepared victims. Sarah allowed the assault to progress for precisely 3 seconds beyond the point where Lawson's intentions became unmistakably clear. This brief interval served multiple tactical purposes. It eliminated any possible ambiguity about his criminal intent. It allowed him to commit fully to actions that would compromise his defensive positioning, and it provided legal justification for whatever level of force might be necessary to end the threat he represented. The transformation from apparent victim to lethal defender occurred in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sarah's right elbow drove backward with surgical precision, targeting the solar plexus with enough force to interrupt Lawson's breathing while stunning his nervous system through pressure wave transmission to vulnerable internal organs. The captain's confident grip on her uniform transformed instantly into desperate grasping as his respiratory system seized and his vision blurred from the trauma radiating through his torso. His superior size and official authority became irrelevant factors as oxygen deprivation began affecting his motor control and cognitive function. Sarah pivoted with fluid grace that would have impressed professional fighters, her left hand intercepting Lawson's reaching arms while her right formed a weapon that targeted his exposed throat with precision that could have crushed his larynx if she had chosen to apply maximum force rather than measured restraint. "Captain," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying deadly calm that contrasted sharply with Lawson's gasping struggle to breathe, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of this training session." Lawson staggered backward, his hands clutching his damaged torso while his mind struggled to process the impossible transformation of his intended victim into someone capable of inflicting serious injury with effortless technique. The careful power dynamic he had constructed through weeks of manipulation had been reversed in seconds by capabilities he could never have anticipated. The maintenance bay that had been selected as the site for assault became the arena where predatory confidence encountered defensive expertise that transformed hunters into prey through the simple application of superior skill and tactical preparation. Lawson's assumptions about military hierarchy and physical dominance crumbled as he faced the reality that his intended victim possessed combat capabilities far beyond anything suggested by her official role or apparent vulnerability. Sarah stood, balanced and ready, her posture reflecting years of training for exactly this type of encounter, while her expression remained as professionally neutral as if she were conducting routine equipment maintenance. The quiet logistics specialist who had endured weeks of escalating harassment had revealed herself to be someone who could end threats decisively when institutional protections proved inadequate. Captain Derek Lawson was about to discover that his career of predatory behavior had finally encountered a victim who fought back with capabilities that would leave him unconscious on the concrete floor while teaching everyone who witnessed the aftermath a lesson about the dangers of underestimating women who appeared vulnerable but possessed the skills necessary to defend themselves against any threat. Captain Derek Lawson staggered against the workbench, His perfectly pressed uniform now disheveled and stained with perspiration as he struggled to comprehend the impossible transformation of his intended victim into someone capable of inflicting serious injury with surgical precision. The solar plexus strike had disrupted his respiratory system, while sending shock waves through his nervous system that left him gasping and disoriented. "What the hell?" Lawson wheezed, his command voice reduced to a desperate rasp as he fought to regain the physical control that had been stripped away in seconds. His hands pressed against his damaged torso, while his mind rejected the evidence of his own vulnerability. Sarah maintained her balanced stance, her body positioned to deliver additional defensive strikes while her expression remained as professionally neutral, as if she were conducting routine inventory procedures. The years of training that had remained hidden beneath layers of military conformity were now fully engaged. Her tactical awareness expanded to encompass every potential threat and opportunity within the maintenance bay. "Sir, I believe you may have injured yourself during the training demonstration," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the same neutral tone she used for all official interactions. "Perhaps you should seek medical attention." The statement reflected tactical psychology designed to create documentation that would support her version of events while providing Lawson with a face-saving explanation for his condition that didn't involve admitting attempted sexual assault. But the captain's ego and criminal intent proved stronger than his survival instincts. Lawson's face contorted with rage as he processed the humiliation of being physically dominated by a subordinate he had selected specifically for her apparent vulnerability. His breathing gradually returned to normal, but his psychological response to unexpected resistance transformed from calculated predation into violent fury that eliminated any remaining pretense of military professionalism. "You fucking bitch," Lawson snarled, his officer's composure completely abandoned as primitive aggression replaced sophisticated manipulation. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm going to destroy your career, and then I'm going to finish what I started." The captain's psychological deterioration from confident predator to enraged attacker represented a critical escalation that eliminated Sarah's remaining options for resolving the situation through de-escalation or withdrawal. His threats made clear that the encounter would end either with her successful defense or his successful assault, with no middle ground for negotiated resolution. Lawson launched himself towards Sarah with the desperate fury of someone whose self-image had been shattered by unexpected resistance. His military training provided basic hand-to-hand combat techniques, but his approach relied primarily on size and aggression rather than the technical sophistication that characterized Sarah's defensive capabilities. Sarah's response demonstrated the vast difference between basic military combatives and professional-level martial arts training refined through years of dedicated practice. She sidestepped Lawson's charge with minimal movement, using his forward momentum against him while her right hand delivered a precise strike to his carotid artery that disrupted blood flow to his brain without causing permanent damage. The captain's vision blurred as oxygen deprivation affected his motor control and cognitive function. He stumbled forward into the workbench, his grasping hands sending tools and equipment crashing to the concrete floor in a cascade of metallic noise that echoed through the maintenance bay like gunshots. "Captain Lawson," Sarah said, her voice carrying a warning edge that suggested she was prepared to escalate defensive measures if the situation continued to deteriorate. "I strongly recommend that you discontinue this training exercise and report to the base medical facility for evaluation." But Lawson's psychological condition had deteriorated beyond rational decision-making. The combination of physical trauma, psychological humiliation, and criminal intent had transformed him into someone operating purely on predatory instinct rather than calculated strategy. His response to Sarah's measured restraint was to interpret it as weakness that could be exploited through increased aggression. The captain grabbed a heavy wrench from the scattered tools, transforming the encounter from unarmed assault into A potentially lethal weapons confrontation. His face reflected the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed identity had been demolished by a subordinate he had dismissed as helpless prey. "I'm going to beat you unconscious and then take what I want," Lawson threatened, raising the wrench in a gesture that left no doubt about his intention to cause serious bodily harm. "And when I'm finished, I'll make sure you're court-martialed for assaulting a superior officer." The introduction of a lethal weapon fundamentally altered the tactical dynamics of the encounter while providing legal justification for whatever level of force Sarah deemed necessary to protect herself. Military law and civilian criminal statutes both recognize the right to self-defense when faced with threats of death or serious bodily harm. Sarah's training included extensive study of weapons retention and disarmament, techniques practiced against opponents wielding everything from knives to firearms. The heavy wrench in Lawson's hands represented a serious threat, but not one that exceeded her defensive capabilities or justified panic rather than controlled tactical response. "Sir, you are placing both of us in danger by introducing weapons into this situation," Sarah said, her voice maintaining professional calm while her body prepared for the lethal force encounter that Lawson's escalation had made inevitable. "I urge you to put down the tool and step away." Lawson's response was to swing the wrench toward Sarah's head with enough force to cause traumatic brain injury or death. His military training had included basic weapons techniques, but his emotional state eliminated the controlled application that made such training effective in actual combat situations. Sarah's defensive response demonstrated why professional martial arts training emphasized mental discipline alongside physical technique. She ducked under the wrench swing while simultaneously closing distance with Lawson, her left hand controlling his weapon arm, while her right delivered a devastating strike to his solar plexus that drove the remaining air from his lungs. The captain doubled over as his respiratory system seized, the wrench falling from nerveless fingers to clatter across the concrete floor. Sarah maintained control of his weapon arm while her knee drove upward into his exposed face with precisely calibrated force, designed to cause unconsciousness without permanent disfigurement. Lawson's head snapped backward from the impact, his eyes rolling upward as his brain shut down to protect itself from trauma. His body went limp and collapsed toward the floor, but Sarah controlled his descent to prevent additional injury from impacting the concrete surface. The entire weapons confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, during which Sarah had neutralized a lethal threat while minimizing harm to her attacker and maintaining complete tactical control of the situation. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, while her awareness expanded to encompass potential complications from the encounter. The maintenance bay fell silent except for Lawson's unconscious breathing and the distant sounds of evening activities from other parts of the base. Sarah stood over her unconscious attacker while conducting rapid assessment of the tactical situation and planning her next actions. According to military regulations and criminal law, the scattered tools and equipment provided clear evidence of a struggle that supported self-defense claims, while Lawson's unconscious condition created immediate medical concerns that required prompt attention regardless of the circumstances that had caused his injuries. Sarah's primary obligation was to ensure that appropriate medical care was provided, while preserving evidence that would support accurate documentation of the incident. But the implications of the encounter extended far beyond immediate medical and legal concerns. Sarah's use of advanced combat techniques against a superior officer would inevitably raise questions about her background and training that could compromise the carefully constructed identity she had maintained throughout her military service. Quiet logistics specialist who had avoided attention through methodical competence and social isolation had been forced to reveal capabilities that would fundamentally alter her relationship with the military hierarchy and her fellow soldiers. There would be investigations, interviews, and scrutiny that could expose aspects of her identity that she had spent years Keeping hidden. Sarah retrieved her cellular phone and dialed the emergency services number that would bring medical personnel and military police to the maintenance bay. Her report would need to be precise and factual while emphasizing Lawson's assault and her defensive response rather than the sophistication of techniques she had employed. "This is Private First Class Sarah Chun reporting from Maintenance Bay 7, she said when the dispatcher answered. "I need immediate medical response for an unconscious officer who was injured during a training accident. I also need military police to respond for an incident involving attempted sexual assault." The dispatcher's questions required careful navigation between accurate reporting and operational security regarding her defensive capabilities. Sarah provided the essential information while avoiding details that might complicate the official investigation or compromise her long-term security within the military structure. As she waited for emergency responders to arrive, Sarah began positioning evidence to support her version of events while ensuring that Lawson received appropriate medical attention despite his criminal intent. The unconscious captain represented both a defeated threat and a potential source of future complications that would require careful management. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of medical personnel and military police who would transform the private encounter into an official incident requiring formal investigation and documentation. Sarah's carefully maintained invisibility was about to become very visible indeed as the consequences of defending herself against attempted rape rippled through the command structure of Fort Benning. But as she looked down at Captain Derek Lawson's unconscious form, Sarah felt no regret about the actions she had taken to protect herself. Years of training and preparation had culminated in successful defense against a predator who had assumed his authority, provided immunity from consequences. The maintenance bay where Lawson had planned to commit assault had become the location where his predatory behavior finally encountered resistance that left him defeated and exposed. Tomorrow, 275 soldiers would learn that their quiet logistics specialist possessed capabilities that transformed victims into defenders and predators into cautionary tales about the dangers of underestimating women who appeared vulnerable but possessed the skills necessary to fight back effectively. The ghost who had hidden in plain sight was finally ready to face whatever consequences resulted from choosing survival over submission, defense over victimization, and action over helpless compliance with criminal intent disguised as military authority. The first responders arrived at Maintenance Bay 7 in a convoy of flashing lights and urgent radio chatter that shattered the evening quiet of Fort Benning. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams led the military police response team, her 20-year career having prepared her for every conceivable type of incident except the scene that awaited her inside the concrete structure. Captain Derek Lawson lay unconscious on the oil-stained floor, his pressed uniform now wrinkled and disheveled, while scattered tools and equipment created a debris field that suggested violent struggle. Above him stood Private First Class Sarah Chun, her posture relaxed and professional despite the obvious signs of confrontation that surrounded her. "Private Chun," Sergeant Williams called out as her team secured the scene. "Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Sarah's response carried the same neutral professionalism that had characterized her military service since arriving at Fort Benning, showing no external signs of the adrenaline surge that had enabled her decisive defensive actions. "No, Sergeant, I am uninjured. Captain Lawson requires immediate medical evaluation." The medics rushed past the military police to assess Lawson's condition, their trained hands checking vital signs and neurological responses, while the unconscious officer began showing signs of returning consciousness. His injuries appeared consistent with blunt force trauma, but the precision of the damage suggested surgical application of force rather than random violence. "What happened here, Private?" Williams asked, her notebook ready to document the initial account that would form the foundation of the official investigation. Her experience with assault cases had taught her to gather information quickly before witnesses could construct alternative narratives or legal considerations, affecting their willingness to provide accurate statements. Sarah's account emphasized Lawson's assault while minimizing the sophistication of her defensive techniques. Captain Lawson summoned me for additional training on equipment maintenance procedures. He began making inappropriate physical contact and verbal threats. When I attempted to maintain professional boundaries, he escalated to physical assault and threatened me with a weapon. The scattered wrench and disturbed equipment provided physical evidence supporting Sarah's narrative, while Lawson's unconscious condition raised obvious questions about how a logistics specialist had managed to defeat a superior officer who possessed significant advantages in size and authority. Major Jennifer Hayes arrived as the senior officer on duty, her presence adding command authority to an incident that was already attracting attention from personnel throughout the base. Hayes had built her reputation on fair but thorough investigation of sensitive cases, making her the logical choice for an incident involving assault allegations against a captain. Sergeant Williams, Major Hayes directed, "I want this scene thoroughly documented before anyone disturbs additional evidence. Private Chun, you'll need to provide a detailed statement once Captain Lawson is stable, and we can establish the full scope of what occurred here." Lawson began regaining consciousness as the medics prepared him for transport to the base medical facility. His first coherent words reflected disorientation and confusion rather than the confident authority that had characterized his predatory approach to the encounter. "What happened?" Lawson mumbled, his hand moving to his damaged face while his eyes struggled to focus on the crowd of personnel surrounding him. "Where am I?" The medics continued their evaluation while noting symptoms consistent with concussion and possible traumatic brain injury. Lawson's vital signs remained stable, but his confusion and memory gaps suggested neurological trauma that would require extensive evaluation and monitoring. "Captain Lawson," Major Hayes said firmly, "you're in Maintenance Bay 7. You've been injured and require medical attention. Do you remember what happened before you lost consciousness?" Lawson's response revealed the fragmented recollection typical of concussion patients, but also suggested awareness that admitting his criminal intent would create serious legal and professional consequences. "I was conducting training with Private Chun. There was some kind of accident with the equipment." The captain's version of events contradicted the physical evidence while avoiding acknowledgement of the assault that had precipitated Sarah's defensive actions. His selective memory could represent genuine trauma-induced amnesia or calculated deception, designed to avoid accountability for his criminal behavior. As medical personnel prepared Lawson for transport, Sergeant Williams began interviewing Sarah in greater detail about the sequence of events that had culminated in her commanding officer's unconscious condition. The questions required careful navigation between accurate reporting and operational security regarding her combat capabilities. "Private Chun, can you describe exactly how Captain Lawson was injured?" Williams asked. "The medical assessment suggests significant blunt force trauma, but the pattern doesn't match typical accident scenarios." Sarah's response emphasized self-defense while downplaying the technical sophistication of her actions. "When Captain Lawson threatened me with the wrench, I defended myself using basic techniques from military training. He fell and struck his head on the equipment when I pushed him away." The explanation provided plausible justification for Lawson's injuries while avoiding detailed description of the martial arts techniques that had actually neutralized the threat he represented. Sarah's account focused on his criminal intent rather than her exceptional defensive capabilities. Major Hayes studied the scene while considering the implications of an incident that involved serious allegations against a commissioned officer, combined with obvious questions about how the situation had been resolved through force. The scattered evidence suggested a struggle far more complex than either participant's initial account indicated. "Private Chun," Major Hayes said carefully, Your personnel file indicates assignment as a logistics specialist with no combat training beyond basic military requirements. How were you able to defend yourself effectively against a larger, stronger opponent who was armed with a weapon? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's carefully maintained cover identity while requiring explanation for capabilities that exceeded her official qualifications. Her response would need to satisfy immediate investigation requirements while protecting long-term operational security regarding her background. "Ma'am, I believe anyone can find unexpected strength when defending themselves against serious threats," Sarah replied. Captain Lawson's injuries resulted from his own aggressive actions rather than any special techniques on my part. The answer deflected specific inquiry about her training while emphasizing Lawson's culpability for the encounter's outcome. But Major Hayes possessed sufficient experience with unusual cases to recognize that Sarah's explanation left significant questions unanswered about her defensive capabilities. Word of the incident began spreading through Fort Benning's informal communication networks faster than official channels could control information flow. Soldiers who had observed Sarah's unremarkable presence for months suddenly found themselves reassessing their assumptions about the quiet logistics specialist who had somehow defeated a superior officer in single combat. Specialist Jennifer Martinez received the news while conducting evening equipment maintenance, her immediate reaction reflecting the shock that would characterize most personnel responses to learning about Sarah's hidden capabilities. "Chun knocked out Captain Lawson?" Martinez asked incredulously. The same Chun who barely says 10 words a day and fixes supply problems without anyone noticing she exists. The revelation forced dramatic reassessment of assumptions about military hierarchy, physical capability, and the danger of underestimating personnel based on official roles rather than individual competence. Sarah's transformation from invisible support soldier to defensive combatant challenged fundamental beliefs about power dynamics within the military structure. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres learned about the incident through official channels that emphasized the assault allegations while providing minimal details about how Sarah had successfully defended herself. His reaction reflected the complex emotions of senior enlisted personnel who understood both the seriousness of the charges and the unusual nature of the resolution. If Captain Lawson assaulted Private Chun, then he got exactly what he deserved, Torres told his fellow NCOs. But I want to know how a logistics specialist managed to put a grown man in the hospital using basic military training. The question would be echoed throughout the base as personnel struggled to reconcile Sarah's official role with her demonstrated capabilities. The incident had transformed her from anonymous support personnel into someone whose true nature remained mysterious but clearly extended far beyond her assigned duties. Back at the medical facility, doctors conducted a comprehensive evaluation of Lawson's injuries while documenting evidence that would support the criminal investigation into his assault charges. The pattern of trauma suggested defensive actions taken by someone with sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and vulnerable pressure points. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the attending physician, noted discrepancies between the captain's claimed memory loss and the precision of injuries that had incapacitated him. Her medical report would become crucial evidence in determining whether criminal charges would be filed against Lawson for attempted sexual assault. The patient shows signs of concussion consistent with targeted strikes rather than accidental trauma, Dr. Martinez documented. The injury pattern suggests defensive actions taken by someone with advanced training in hand-to-hand combat techniques. Meanwhile, Sarah underwent her own medical evaluation to document any injuries that might support her self-defense claims. The examination revealed minor bruising consistent with physical struggle, but no serious trauma that would indicate she had been overpowered or seriously injured during the encounter. The physical evidence supported Sarah's account of successful defense against Lawson's assault, but also raised obvious questions about how she had achieved such decisive Results against a larger opponent who possessed both weapons and positional advantages. As night fell over Fort Benning, the ripple effects of the Maintenance Bay incident continued expanding through the base's social networks. 275 soldiers were discovering that their assumptions about hierarchy, capability, and the quiet woman they had barely noticed were fundamentally incorrect. Sarah's carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered by the necessity of defending herself against criminal assault. Tomorrow would bring official investigations, detailed questioning, and scrutiny that would challenge every aspect of the identity she had constructed during her military service. But as she sat in the military police station providing additional statements about the incident, Sarah felt no regret about the actions she had taken to protect herself. Years of preparation had culminated in successful defense against a predator who had assumed vulnerability where he had actually found lethal competence. Dawn broke over Fort Benning with the promise of a day that would fundamentally alter the base's understanding of hierarchy, capability, and the woman who had spent months invisible among them. The morning formation stretched across the parade ground, but today the rigid lines of soldiers carried an electric tension that crackled through the ranks like static electricity before a thunderstorm. 275 men and women stood at attention, their uniforms crisp and their positions perfect, but their minds focused entirely on the empty space where Captain Derek Lawson should have been standing. Word of the previous evening's incident had spread through the barracks like wildfire, carrying with it rumors and speculation that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Major Jennifer Hayes took position at the front of the formation. Her presence commanding immediate silence from soldiers who understood that significant announcements were about to reshape their understanding of recent events. Behind her, Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base commander, surveyed the assembled troops with the grave expression of a leader, preparing to address serious matters that would affect the entire command structure. "Soldiers," Major Hayes began, her voice carrying across the parade ground with crystal clarity. "Last evening, an incident occurred that resulted in criminal charges being filed against Captain Derek Lawson for attempted sexual assault. The investigation is ongoing, but I can confirm that Captain Lawson has been relieved of command and is facing court-martial proceedings." The announcement sent shock waves through the formation, though most soldiers had already heard fragments of the story through unofficial channels. The confirmation of assault charges against a commissioned officer represented a serious breach of military discipline that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Additionally, Hayes continued, "I want to address the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this incident. Private First Class Sarah Chun successfully defended herself against assault using techniques that prevented serious harm while neutralizing the threat posed by her attacker." Every eye in the formation turned toward the back ranks where Sarah stood at rigid attention, her expression maintaining the neutral professionalism that had characterized her entire military service. But now that professional demeanor took on new significance as soldiers realized they were looking at someone whose capabilities extended far beyond her official role. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, her decades of military experience evident in every precise movement. Private Chun, front and center. Sarah marched forward through the silent formation, her footsteps echoing across the concrete with the measured precision that had always characterized her movement. But now that precision suggested tactical awareness rather than simple military discipline, each step calculated and controlled by someone comfortable with being the center of attention despite months of studied invisibility. "Private First Class Sarah Chun," Colonel Morrison announced to the assembled formation, "you will report to my office immediately following this formation for discussion of matters relating to your background and qualifications." The colonel's statement confirmed what many soldiers had already begun suspecting. Sarah's personnel file contained information that hadn't been shared with her immediate supervisors, and her defensive capabilities suggested training that extended far beyond basic military requirements. As the formation dispersed and soldiers headed toward their daily duties, conversations erupted throughout the base as personnel struggled to process the revelation that their quiet logistics specialist possessed combat skills sufficient to defeat a superior officer in armed confrontation. Specialist Jennifer Martinez found herself surrounded by soldiers, seeking her perspective on Sarah's transformation from invisible support personnel to defensive combatant. Her natural leadership position within the social hierarchy made her a focal point for questions and speculation about what other secrets might be hidden beneath carefully maintained facades. "I always knew there was something different about Chun," Martinez told her gathered audience, though her claim represented retrospective analysis rather than actual prior knowledge. She never participated in conversations about relationships or personal problems. Always seemed like she was analyzing everything around her. Private First Class Tommy Wilson, whose earlier assumption about Captain Lawson's professionalism now seemed incredibly naive, struggled to reconcile his limited understanding of military hierarchy with the reality of predatory behavior disguised as authority. "How could we not see what Captain Lawson was doing?" Wilson asked, his voice reflecting the confusion of someone discovering that institutional structures provided inadequate protection against determined criminals. If Chun could recognize the threat, why didn't any of us notice the warning signs? The question highlighted systemic failures in military culture that enabled predatory behavior while silencing victims through hierarchical intimidation and institutional protection of authority figures. Sarah's successful defense had exposed vulnerabilities in command structures that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres used the incident as a teaching moment for junior enlisted personnel who needed to understand the complex dynamics that governed military justice and personal protection within institutional frameworks. "The lesson here isn't that Private Chun is some kind of superhero," Torres explained to his group of junior NCOs. "The lesson is that predators exist at every level of the military hierarchy, and institutional authority doesn't guarantee moral behavior. We all have a responsibility to recognize and report inappropriate conduct before it escalates to criminal assault." Meanwhile, in Colonel Morrison's office, Sarah faced the most comprehensive questioning of her military career as senior officers attempted to understand how a logistics specialist had acquired combat capabilities that exceeded those of most infantry soldiers. The conference room contained personnel whose security clearances provided access to classified information that might explain the discrepancies in Sarah's background. "Private Chun," Colonel Morrison began, "your personnel file contains certain administrative annotations that suggest your assignment to this base involved considerations beyond normal logistical requirements. I need you to explain how you acquired the combat training that enabled your defensive actions last evening." Sarah's response required careful balance between operational security requirements and the legitimate need for command authority to understand her capabilities and background. Her military service had always involved compartmentalized information that couldn't be shared with personnel lacking appropriate clearances. "Ma'am, I received specialized training prior to my current assignment that prepared me for various contingencies that might arise during military service. The specific nature of that training is classified above my authority to discuss without appropriate authorization." The statement confirmed that Sarah's background involved classified programs, while providing justification for her reluctance to reveal details about her combat capabilities. Her response suggested federal agencies or special operations programs, rather than conventional military training pathways. Major Hayes consulted documents that had been expedited through classified channels overnight, revealing information that explained Sarah's presence at Fort Benning while raising additional questions about the scope of her actual mission and capabilities. "Private Chun," Hayes continued, We've received communication from agencies that confirm your participation in programs designed to identify and neutralize security threats within military installations. Your assignment here was specifically designed to monitor potential problems that might affect base security and personnel safety. The revelation transformed Sarah's role from logistics specialist to undercover security operative, explaining her methodical competence and observational skills while providing context for her defensive capabilities. Her months of invisible service had been directed toward identifying exactly the type of predatory behavior that Captain Lawson had been exhibiting. Your defensive actions against Captain Lawson represent successful completion of a mission that protected not only yourself but potentially numerous other victims who might have been targeted if his predatory behavior had continued unchecked. Colonel Morrison added, Sarah's response reflected the professional discipline that had enabled her covert operations while acknowledging the personal satisfaction of successful mission completion. Ma'am, I was prepared to continue monitoring the situation, but Captain Lawson's escalation to direct assault required immediate defensive action. The conference room discussion revealed that Sarah's assignment had been coordinated with federal agencies concerned about patterns of sexual assault within military installations. Her role had been to identify predators operating within command structures while gathering evidence that could support criminal prosecutions. The evidence you gathered during your assignment, combined with your successful defense against actual assault, provides the foundation for criminal charges that should result in Captain Lawson's conviction and imprisonment, Major Hayes explained. But the exposure of Sarah's true mission created complications for her continued service in covert capacities. Her public demonstration of combat capabilities made future undercover assignments impossible, while her success against Lawson would likely attract attention from other bases dealing with similar problems. Private Chun, Colonel Morrison announced, you're being reassigned to a position that utilizes your investigative and defensive capabilities in an official capacity. Your new role will involve training other personnel in threat recognition and self-defense while serving as a liaison with federal agencies conducting security investigations. The promotion represented official recognition of Sarah's contributions while providing career advancement that matched her actual qualifications rather than her cover identity. Her transformation from invisible logistics specialist to security specialist reflected the military's need for personnel capable of addressing complex threats that traditional command structures couldn't handle effectively. As news of Sarah's true role spread through Fort Benning's communication networks, soldiers who had dismissed her as unremarkable support personnel began reassessing their interactions with someone who had been analyzing their behavior for months while maintaining perfect operational security. The maintenance bay where Captain Lawson had planned to commit assault became an unofficial landmark representing the moment when institutional predation encountered individual capability that transformed victims into defenders and criminals into cautionary tales about the dangers of underestimating women who appeared vulnerable but possessed lethal competence. Sarah's story spread beyond Fort Benning through military networks that carried her example to other installations where predatory behavior flourished in the shadows of official authority. Her successful defense inspired other victims while demonstrating that hierarchical intimidation could be overcome through superior capability and tactical preparation. The quiet woman who had spent months invisible among 275 soldiers had proven that true strength often existed beneath unremarkable facades, that official authority provided no protection against determined resistance, and that predators who chose their victims poorly might discover that some prey fought back with capabilities that transformed hunters into the hunted. Private First Class Sarah Chun had become Specialist Sarah Chun, security investigator, defensive tactics instructor, and living proof that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones nobody saw coming until it was too late to avoid the consequences of underestimating someone whose silence concealed capabilities rather than weakness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.